Welcome to MSD at Home series. Thank you for joining us. My name is Djordje STOJANOVIC. I'm a senior lecturer in architectural design here at the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to their elders past and present. My pleasure is to introduce SOPHIA MAALSEN, who is a researcher at the School of Architecture, Design and Planning at the University of Sydney. Sophia's work has been published in journals such as Social and Cultural Geography and Australian Geographer, and her recent research focuses on the topic of share housing, which is the practice of sharing home with other unrelated occupants. Share housing is a form of housing which is not sufficiently understood. It is interesting to us who are working in Studio Epsilon, capstone subject of architecture major of the Bachelor of Design, the subject which I'm coordinating, and where we're working on a housing project. And a lot of our work there is related to sharing. A lot of our projects have included some component of home sharing there. What we know about home sharing is that it is on the increase, and it is often associated with rental tenure. But again, as we've mentioned, it's something that is not fully researched and fully understood. And therefore, a conversation with Sophia will give us a lot of new insights, and we are hoping that her contribution to our debate will be also from another particular angle, which is related to the role of digital technologies in mediating and facilitating home sharing as one of the forms of housing. So without further ado, I'll let Sophia talk. I'll just remind everyone that the question and answer sessions will remain open throughout the presentation, and we look forward to your questions and the debate at the end. Sophia, it's all yours.
All right. Thanks, Djordje. It's a pleasure to be here, everyone. Before I begin, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country. I'm speaking to you today from Gadigal country in Sydney at the University of Sydney campus. So I'll just share my screen. Today, I'll be speaking to you about share housing. That one there, I'm just starting with a picture on the from my Twitter account, is one of my favorite old share houses. We were very proud of our, let's say, our very makeshift table. But anyway, for a little bit of context, why I'm talking about share housing and why it's important in terms of our housing experiences. So the housing experiences of Australians have been changing in the face of three intersecting processes. And the first is declining home ownership. The second is shifting labour markets, which is having an impact on the ability to own a home. And the third is digital disruption. So rising housing unaffordability coupled with employment precarity means that a growing cohort of younger Australians can no longer expect a job for life or to own their own home. Declining home ownership is exacerbated by long-term shifts in labour markets that are characterised by short-term contracts and casualisation, and demands that workers be mobile, flexible and agile. And so even if we think that housing market was to return to normal in terms of that home ownership was accessible, these labour conditions are incompatible with the income stability as well as the ability to stay in place that's generally required to mortgage a house. So what we're seeing in response is a greater diversity in our housing systems in terms of these different ways of living and thinking about living, and that's where sharing comes in. So with the decline of home ownership, we see a correlating increase in a rise of people renting and renting for longer in life. And within this sector, there's an increasing subsector of people sharing housing, either in the traditional form of a share house or in other forms such as what we're seeing with the growth of CoLiving models. So in today's presentation, I'll be delving more deeply into this growth of shared living, primarily through the lens of what we would think is traditional share housing, looking at the growth of sharing, the motivations for sharing, and the meaning that sharing has for home. But let's see, before we look at share housing in more detail, this is a good outline of the lecture. I'll first address the way that shared living is generally perceived in countries where home ownership is normalised and aspirational, before then looking at the growth of share housing across a range of demographics. I'll then look at the main motivations for sharing housing before looking at the characteristics that we see around what makes a good flatmate and what makes a good share house. And then we'll finish with a little bit of a discussion about how this problematizes our notions of home and what this means for our housing futures. So there's, two predominant ways in which share housing is generally being considered in the literature. And one is as inferior to home ownership, and the other is somehow that it's outside of mainstream housing. So somehow, you're abnormal if you live in a shared residence. So think about intentional communities like cooperatives and communes, things like that. So I'll begin with shared housing first as something that's considered inferior to owner-occupied. So for those of you who don't know, that top picture there is an image from the movie. He died with a falafel in his hand, which is based on the book. He died with a falafel in his hand, which is a very humorous account of share housing. Shall you ever have the opportunity to watch it or read it? So, shared living in general is considered less aspirational than an owner-occupied and single-family dwelling, and there are a few reasons for that. In Australia, home ownership is entangled with morality, and the owner-occupied home being a sort of performance of good citizenship. For example, Emma Power's work shows that home ownership is intricately related to ideal ageing by self-insuring against the fiscal risk of ageing and reducing the role of government in providing for old age. So, if you own your home and you're mortgage-free by the end of it, there's less, dependency on welfare. The central role of the family-owned home extends beyond Australian contexts. For example, Helen Jarvis notes how our conventional thoughts around home ownership and single-family dwelling diminishes the social meaning and practical value of shared accommodations. For Jarvis, the normalisation of single-family dwelling and home ownership not only devalues alternative models, but is also increasingly unsustainable, socially, economically, and environmentally. However, changing social demands require different dwelling models are needed, and Jarvis identifies changes in the types of dwelling, including variations in household structures, non-traditional families, diverse patterns of mobility, and increasingly complex transitions and changes in household composition over the life course. So this idea of a sort of owner-occupied home that will see somebody through for the rest of their life is increasingly incompatible with our reality. Yet despite this, the belief that people will only be sharing housing in extraordinary situations remains strong. There are, of course, historically challenges to the single-family dwelling, often driven by social, environmental, and sustainability politics. And some of those come around through this next sort of trope around shared housing as somehow mainstream or outside of the mainstream or alternative. So these forms of shared living are often defined as intentional communities and include various forms such as housing cooperatives, communes, and the kibbutz. So the motivations for living communally are often underpinned by social or environmental politics. For feminists, single-family dwellings are obstacles to forwarding the position of women due to their isolation and as a site of gendered domestic labour. Cooperative housing models were argued as a corrective, affording the socialisation of domestic work. Additionally, we see single-family dwellings being critiqued as environmentally unstable. So we've seen feminists argue that shared dwellings could overcome issues of isolation, reconfigure everyday domestic labour, and reduce the unnecessary consumption and waste from single household dwellings. Indeed, the general view that cooperative housing is somehow characterised by the departure from traditional family structures, gender emancipation and grassroots response to social and environmental and economic crises has been reinforced in the recent literature and research around co-housing. But co-housing is also changing. So more recently, we're seeing co-housing emerging in what we call co-living provider models. In Australia, this often emerges as part of the build-to-rent sector. So co-living is another form of shared living that's increasingly drawing attention. Companies such as US-based Common or UCO here in Sydney offer flexible serviced accommodation options. Many are targeted at highly mobile, millennial, entrepreneurial audiences and are designed to not only provide access to highly serviced accommodation, but to facilitate the exchange of ideas in the context of the startup community, similar to these earlier incarnations of hacker houses. Here, housing is seen as a service. So, for example, James Scott, who's Chief Operating Officer of London co-living startup, The Collective, describes co-living as a way that culturally and socially emancipated millennials have reconfigured their housing needs as living as a service. We can critique this, of course. It's less a choice driven by culturally and social emancipation, but is rather a reflection of changing housing trajectories in the face of a declining home ownership and increased precarity. So co-living developments are designed with both shared and private spaces and are intended to support social interaction. As noted, they attract a predominantly young, mobile and professional audience, although there are offerings that attract more diverse audiences and which are purposely built for diverse community. There are parallels here in design approaches with the co-housing developments intended to facilitate community, such as cooperatives and kibbutz, but definitely on a whole different level here of, politics and ideology. Here, spaces are designed to encourage social interaction, to build community, often characterized by a combination of accessible, communal, and private spaces. So co-living spaces are similarly designed to create moments of social interaction with the broader ideal of assisting the development of entrepreneurial ideas, so that you're sharing spaces with other people who have ideas, and as you're having a chat in your communal kitchen, you're exchanging these and developing some great new startup, basically. A variation on this theme are services such as that offered by US-based company The Outpost, which retains a more traditional share housing format by subleasing a suite of properties, but maintaining the flexibility offered by the co-housing companies. So companies that take this approach recruit and manage leases and then offer rooms and various living arrangement options to their members, guaranteeing a standard of services required to live and work easily, flexible lease options, and same-day move options. Members can move within a network of properties across neighbourhoods and cities, and with short notice in an effort to bring the user choice qualities of the on-demand and share economies to housing. So this sort of approach, or the reason driving this, is reflected in this quote from an excerpt from an interview I conducted with a company based in New York. So I think if I'm just looking at general trends of how we do everything, I walk out of the subway and I've ordered a Starbucks for me to pick up. Or, it's easy getting cabs, but I've never used regular taxis anymore. I get Uber. It feels like the control's a little bit more in your hand. So you can do a lot of things that are based on rating systems and flexibility and on-demand things when you need them. And I think that's probably the direction for everything. And housing is lagging behind some of this lower hanging fruit. So here it's about, again, reconceptualizing and repackaging housing as a service, which in itself is a whole other debate, but something that, suits your lifestyle. If you're highly mobile, you can just move on demand into a new place within the network that you subscribe to within 24 hours. Everything's supplied, or the internet, everything is already there ready for you to go. But to get back to the ways that shared living is viewed, we see it primarily positioned as non-normative or somehow less than home ownership. And particularly these co-living models aren't there for, aren't sort of envisioning long-term leases for the rest of your life. It seems to be a very temporary sort of solution to access of accommodation. Part of the reason for this sort of non-normative and lesser status is also because of our understanding of what home is and the affordances that are given to homeowners. In countries like Australia, where we have a very strong desire to own home, and it's reflected in our policies as well, the dominant or ideal version of house as home typically portrays belonging and intimacy among members of a heterosexual nuclear family living in detached or owner-occupied dwelling, often in a suburban location. It is also a space where one is expected to be able to maintain some agency and live without too many constraints. For example, being able to have pets or hang pictures on the walls, things that homeowners can do, but as anyone who rents knows, this is far more challenging. And sharing with people who are not part of your family also makes this more challenging. You have more opportunity for conflict and things like that. So shared living doesn't necessarily fit these ideals of home and share housing, particularly when it is rented, is rarely positioned as aspirational. But this doesn't mean that the shared living and shared housing is not valuable. The political underpinnings of cooperative models of housing and the flexibility of co-living models are drivers of alternatives to the owner-occupied home. But what about share housing in the context of how we're going to look at it here? So what motivates people to share house? Who makes a good flatmate? And how does home materialize in a share house? Well, first of all, the definition of share housing that I'm working from is this one here from the Redfern Legal Centre. So a living arrangement where a number of people share a house. They split the rent and the general living costs. The house can be set up as a co-tenancy, a head tenancy and a subtenancy, a lodging, or a combination of these. It can be rewarding, economical, varied and challenging depending on who you are and your personal circumstances. So this type of share housing is emerging as a growing subsection of generation rent. It's characterised by this decline in sole person rented households as well. So increasingly as well, in addition to increasing time spent renting and growing diversity in the demographics of tenants. The Departments of Fair Trading, New South Wales, notes that single person renter households are in decline, and the proportion of shared households is growing at a considerable rate. Moreover, at least a third of people living in the private rental market have now done so for 10 years or more. So the growing trend of share households is attributed to a combination of shifting social norms along with the shortage of affordable rental housing. And this has created an emerging group of tenants that we can see here, professionals, couples, young families and students who can't afford to buy or rent an entire property of their own. These are turning to shared occupancy as an affordable way to live. Homeowners themselves are also noted as a group for whom shared occupancy has benefits by generating additional income for mortgage repayments. So this is all part of something more around delayed pathways to home ownership, and it's not just happening in Australia. Predominantly, this is contextualised in the post-global financial crash of 2008. So in the UK, the recession has affected younger generations' abilities to live independently and increased reliance on intragenerational financial assistance. According to Sue Heath and colleagues, the rise of people sharing housing with non-kin is driven by rising house costs, population increase, and a dearth of affordable accommodation. In Australia, disruption to home ownership is also materialising across generations, with people either delaying or also falling out of home ownership. So research from online flatmate site flatmates.com.au reported an increase in people over 40 using the site to find share housing. They did an analysis of close to 64,000 room wanted profiles and reported a 20% increase in the months of January and February between 2015 and 2016 in those aged over 40 looking for share accommodation, with the biggest increases in the 60 to 64 age group and with 43% growth, alongside the 50 to 54 years old age group with 31% growth and 29% growth in those over 65. These trends are reflected in the census data. So this is some data from New South Wales from the last census, where we see group housing grow overall between the last census, but in the Greater Sydney region, it grew in particular. So we see it's decreasing in the 17 to 24 age group, which is what we would have traditionally associated it with students, basically. And increasing across all other age groups. So I guess one of the key things that I'm trying to get at here about share housing in the context of the broader housing market as well is that we see people still share housing or returning to share housing who would have by now been able to either afford their own home or afford to rent individually. So, which kind of brings me to the motivations for share housing. We're seeing a growth in it, but why is it happening? So here I'm drawing upon some exploratory research conducted with people share housing in Sydney to look at why they share house. Sydney is an ideal place to study this because there's quite a high demand on housing and there's also high housing affordability. I should note that obviously this is all pre-COVID. We've seen some more room for rental bargaining open up in that, and that's something I'll touch on briefly later. The results are based on a survey of 149 people, and from these responses, 5 general motivations emerged, and these were economic as the main driver, social, the location played a big part in it, adulthood and independence, sustainability, and then others, which we're not going to get into today. But let's have a look at economic motivators first. So economic factors are the driving choice, are driving the choice to share house. And this is perhaps unsurprising considering an upward trend in rental prices and household stress in Sydney over the last 5 years. Rising housing unaffordability is reflected in participant comments about economic factors motivating their decision to share house. So we have here, I can't afford a nice apartment alone. It's too expensive to rent for one. The only financially viable way to live in areas of Sydney that have access to decent transport, and I can't afford to live alone and save for buying a house. So these were just a few quotes, but are very representative of most of the people's responses around this particular motivation. The primacy of economic factors as the driver of participants' decision to share is concurrent with Sue Heath and colleagues' observations on share housing in Britain as an economic necessity. Being a necessity means it's less a choice and more sort of, your only available option. And this suggests that unlike some earlier research around share housing, which showed that participants chose to share not because they couldn't afford anything else, but for the lifestyle factors, what we're seeing is a majority of participants in this research at least are sharing because they can't afford anything else. Now, despite economic factors being a big driver, it actually doesn't preclude the social or lifestyle benefits generated from share housing. Social factors were still quite strong, and the social networks and the support that sharing affords was a substantially strong influence with motivation to share, with 74 participants noting it as important. In fact, 6 listed social factors as their only motivation, which means that, yes, economic is a necessity, but it does mean that the social value that we find in share housing is still valued. So some participants had moved to Sydney and other cities and noted that share housing was an effective way to develop a social network. And for some people, they choose to share even if they could afford to rent alone. So we see that here with participant 62. It's impossible to rent alone due to price. However, I prefer the social element of share housing and would do so voluntarily. So I'm having trouble speaking today. There's also, you know, preference to live with others, getting to know people, cheaper rent. This also came up, the ability to be able to share your feelings and access the support of your flatmates. And this idea that you create a family atmosphere as well. So, you know, building a share house was in some cases compared to building a family. And it was also appreciated for facilitating the sharing of labour and household costs alongside the additional sociability. Location was also a factor which is related to affordability. Being able to afford to live in a preferred area close to the city, work or a university with access to public transport was also one of the appealing reasons for share housing. Participants noted that sharing provided them with greater choices and the opportunity to live in desirable areas. So this linking of affordability and proximity to the city or to the areas that they chose to live suggested that location was more highly valued than living alone, yet further away. So yet the closer you get to desirable places like the inner city or close to university, the higher costs there are associated with living. So share housing comes in that way as an affordable option to achieve the benefits of proximity and reduced commute time and affordability. So participant responses reflect recent work on private renting as constructive coping. So in this particular work, research sort of suggests that for many renters, location and lifestyle rather than home ownership is of particular importance, at least in the short term to medium term. So while Kath Holz's, Morris and Paulson's research was not directed at renters who are particularly in share housing, they are parallels with location and the lifestyle choices expressed by participants here. For some participants, share housing enabled an affordable way to live close to the city, close to work, and to the perks of inner city life. So one of the other themes, and this is one that we would have traditionally expected, is that, you know, people see share housing as an indicator of adulthood and maintaining or developing independence as they move out of the family home. For the participants who sort of value the independence and freedom of share housing was seen as the initial step in moving away from the family home and often coincided with the move to university and moving in with a friend group. So we can see here participants noting it's the opportunity to exercise independency, freedom, adulthood, new friendships, and building a new family. Wanting to live my own life and do so affordably. So these accounts reflect the traditional literature on share housing as a transitional stage of housing between moving out of your family home and finding a place of your own. The work of McNamara and Connell, for example, noted that most of their respondents positioned share housing as a lifestyle choice that allowed residential independence. Their work was conducted in 2007 when the housing market wasn't quite as tight. But the survey respondents who did, this is perhaps unsurprising, note that adulthood and independence were a motivator for their choice to share. We're in the younger age groups, in the 18 to 34 age group. So that's perhaps unsurprising, but we don't see that reflected in the higher age groups. In fact, beyond these age groups, independence wasn't a dominant narrative in the decision to share house. So the changing demographics of share housing as outlined mean that its value as a site of independence from the family home is less relevant to those in their mid-30s and beyond who've already established their independence. But it doesn't detract from the value of share housing in developing freedom, independence, and adulthood. In fact, considering the increasing role of share housing as a tenure option, we can argue that it's becoming a signifier of adulthood beyond student days. Now, the other sort of debates around sharing are around sustainability. You know, it wasn't mentioned so much by the participants, but when it was done as a deliberate choice, so a political, environmental choice to do this. So the understanding is that sharing houses and resources is better for the environment and society. And this is more similar to those, I guess, the drivers of those intentional communities and communes, sort of, you know, the kind of stuff that we associate with communes or housing cooperatives and things like that, a much more social and environmental political approach to living. So, for example, this participant here was, you know, there are environmental considerations, fewer appliances per capita, lower electricity use, less food waste, shared responsibilities, you know, supporting each other through social pressure to be environmentally conscious, and, you know, that the whole idea of living in shared arrangements makes you socially and environmentally sustainable through practice and through socializing. So this explicit link to the social environmental sustainability here reflects, you know, these models that we talked about earlier as a political and ideological choice for share housing that we see in sort of earlier models of alternative living. You know, we see this in earlier research again on shared housing, which highlights the link between share housing and resource sustainability, as well as an ideological opposition to the nuclear family. But we should be careful in what we think is sustainable in a way, because sustainability isn't always the outcome of shared housing. While share housing can have sustainable outcomes, as we've noted by two participants or more other research, it can also accelerate consumption through the individualization and multiplication of daily activities. Work done by Clocker, Gibson and Borger notes that while extended families, households for example, so more than one generation living there, while that can facilitate the pooling and sharing of resources, practices which are associated with sustainability outcomes, the cultural and social values can disrupt any gains. So an emphasis on privacy and individual autonomy, characteristic of what we see in the industrialized West, shapes both housing design and resource consumption. So, you know, shared living arrangements in some research study reflects this more complex story of unsustainable paired with sustainable practices. When you see, you know, the multiplication of devices such as TVs and spaces such as bathrooms and kitchens to facilitate individual consumption, contrasting with sharing and reusing spaces, objects, tasks, and resources. And you see that with share housing, you know, people sitting in their own rooms or on their own laptop or devices, things like that, multiple bathrooms, etc. So that addresses some of the main whys of share housing, with the motivations ranking as the main driver, but also the social nature of share housing being highly valued. But there's more to my sort of, I guess, treatise on share housing. And as hinted at by the title of this presentation, we're also going to be looking at the third sort of factor that's affecting it, and that's the digitalisation of share housing. So this is reflective of the broader digital reconfiguration and platform sort of underpinning of daily life. So sites such as flatmates.com.au, Gumtree and Facebook specific groups for housing are frequently used to find suitable housing, and they also provide insight into the characteristics people are looking for when choosing flatmates and shared household. So I'm going to touch on some research which looks at the profiles from these sites, some research I've done here with Nicole Gurran, but I'll note to begin with that these profiles are not necessarily true reflections of the household or the flatmate, but are online performances of, you know, what people think somebody wants in a house. So they're putting their best selves forward. They're still useful for gaining a view into the practices of share housing and what this means for our understanding of home. So here I'll be drawing on research that Professor Nicole Gurran and myself conducted on flatmate profiles, which we web scraped from flatmates.com.au, and highlighted some particularly recurrent themes around time, work, rules, the ability to have guests over, etc. And these sort of came to the fore as important in creating a good share house. So less about the dynamics, and we'll just jump into, to the actual quantities, and we'll just jump into the themes. So time and household temporality were a common key theme of the ads. Of those posting an ad to find a house, closer to 3,000 of them referred to time, while household ads made reference to them close to 1,000 times. So time was predominantly referred to in the context of actually being absent from the house. So for example, references to working full time, not being at home all the time, and both needing and understanding the needs of others to have their own quiet time and to have their space. So we can see this here. I'm going to be working on days I'm not in school, on the days that I'm not in school, so won't be home much. I'll barely be home because I'll be working and studying. I'm working full time, so I'm back home later during the week. This kind of stuff. I work long shifts, so I'm out most of the time. So there's this very, I guess, recognition that showing that you're not going to be at home a lot will be beneficial for a share house. They're framing their absence from home as a selling point. Across the data set, being busy and out of the house was described as a positive aspect, indicating that they wouldn't overuse household space. We also saw this in the household ads, although less to an extent, because they're the ones who have more power in this scenario. They're the ones who get to choose the flatmate rather than the other way around. Time also came into play around household management and financial responsibility. So another frequent use of time was in expressing your timeliness with paying your bills and rents. And these are things that we can associate with being a good flatmate. Time also emerged in relation to social aspects of forming a household. There were some that expressed aspirations for flatmates to spend time together and build a household, although often on a time-limited basis again, so not being at home all the time and having barely time to be at home, but still wanting to spend time with your flatmates. So one particular quote that encapsulates this was from one person whose notes that they work mainly night times and my shifts are a bit all over the place, but I'm keen to find someone I can become friends with, but also have our separate time when needed. So here we go, sorry, this particular slide here. And this other one that we're 3 girls in the apartment, all of us are working full time. We've become friends and would love to welcome the first person as a friend too. So these kind of comments sort of show a tension emerging between time spent being present in the house and participating in the social aspects of a household, and also being absent, giving others space. So time, one of the other themes was work. And unsurprisingly, they're included there as a signifier of financial responsibility, but also again of a sort of a hint at being able to be absent from the house. So mentions of work hours were often combined with the reference to time spent in leisure activities away from the house to further sort of, reduce the time that they're at home. So, I work a lot. After work, I like to hit the gym, or otherwise I'm spending a lot of time with my friends. Or I work 6 days a week, so already I'm not going to be home a lot. And when I'm not at work, I'm either working on my car or at the beach, So again, here's somebody who sounds like they would never be at home at all. So while it is unsurprising that those looking for a room paid more attention to bringing the benefits of their working life, income and time away from the house to the fore, those posting in the house ads also use their employment status as an indicator of responsibility, and expectations around the management of the household. These are not student party households, but those are professionals. So, this particular quote here, we're goal-oriented and career-focused. We are looking to build a productive and inspiring environment at home, and we often engage in productive discussions during the week. But during the weekends, we like to step out and have a good time before getting back to work the week after. These descriptions continue to emphasize sort of this connection between absence and employment as important to share housing, and situate these within broader expectations of behaviour. These are not the kind of houses that we see in, like, he died with a falafel in his hands and things like that, but sort of flatmate from hell narrative or student share housing days. Now, the other theme is around socialising guests and rules of the household. The reason why I look at this is in terms it's important because, again, it comes back to our notions of home. Home is generally associated with agency, privacy, and secure space, but also as a place that has the capacity to nurture social relationships. So agency includes being able to socialise and live within reasonable rules. The extent to which someone who's sharing a house can ever fully exert this agency is constrained, and particularly so when a person is seeking to join another household, where expectations or rules are able to be established by the existing members of the house. And they may also have special status as an owner of the house or as named tenants on a rental lease. So what we found in our analysis of the ads of people advertising themselves as potential flatmates was a downplaying of their social needs and activities. So, I'm not the type to throw parties or have guests over options. This other person here making a subtle hint to their desire for guests, but emphasizing that their guests will be non-disrupted and, they won't be intrusive and they'll be respectful of the others. So I'm currently dating. It's important that I'm living with someone who can compromise when it comes to guests, though I am very respectful and avoid having anyone over too often. And again, I want to live with people who are okay with having guests over. So those offering accommodation were concerned to establish rules without seeming overly restrictive. Where household rules were stated, they were generally framed as standard or not fussy, based around respect and household harmony. So again, no special rules, just basic considerations for each other. Rest of the rules are pretty standard, apart from wearing shoes in the house, and we're pretty easygoing. We're not fussy, but keep things reasonably tidy. So nothing terribly groundbreaking there. But in some cases, we do see some specific rules, and this was more to do around actually sort of more complex needs of some of the households. And one of those was parenting, which I'll get on to now. So parenting and sharing was a theme with particular issues around social relations and time in the home. Some were keen to emphasise that their child wouldn't be disruptive or even around often, due, for instance, to custody arrangements. So I'm looking for some space for me and my young daughter, but she's rather quiet, but also social. I have an 8-year-old daughter that stays with me in the afternoons, Mondays to Fridays, until my wife picks her up around 6 p.m. And here, my son is quiet and very friendly. So, trying to negotiate this balance between having children and actually sharing households, which in itself is a whole other dynamic and far more challenging. And so others sought to be explicitly sharing with other single parents. So because they'll be more aware of the needs of this. So this particular person here, I'm looking for a place with another single mum to share with that's clean and tidy. So these single parents seeking shared accommodation for themselves and their children are likely to face particular barriers in finding suitable housing. Research has shown, research by Lauster and Easterbrook suggests that, the structural accumulated disadvantage in which discrimination in areas such as employment, education, credit rating, intersect, produce further discrimination in the housing market. And one of the sort of areas where this is compounded is by single mothers and often on social assistance. And this is often, provides more challenges because in a context where, we see landlords preferring tenants on dual incomes, and so single parents are seen as presenting a higher risk. So the housing options have been limited. They have generally less economic resources to draw upon. So sharing housing becomes one of the few options that they can. So the additional challenges faced by single parents in the private rental market means that sharing housing may be one of the few affordable options available. However, single parents who are sharing housing with strangers experience additional stresses. Some research has shown that the existing literature shows concerns of increased risk to children pertaining to issues with the quality of shared accommodation and the presence of strangers, a lack of privacy, which may affect the ability of a parent to build a relationship with their child, as well as a lack of adequate play space. And also a heightened chance of conflicts surrounding child visitation due to the shared nature of the space, the attitudes of the other tenants, and the unpredictability of shared households. So there are some additional barriers there compared to, in terms of trying to access housing compared to, say, people who are just single, unattached, working full-time with very limited care responsibilities, and because of that are also able to not be at home as much. So it comes also back to that theme of temporality. In one sense, the themes discussed here are not specific to share housing. All households have temporal rhythms and structure, and household members are constantly negotiating their behaviours to share space and resources. But what emerges through this flatmate and share house listings is a recognition of the added constraints of sharing and renting a house with non-related adults, and often those beyond an organic friendship or social network, has on the ability to fully claim agency over a space and do the normal things adults do within the home. That is, being at home, having guests over and maintaining relationships, and things like that. These potential negotiations from a market currency which is magnified by the online marketplace for flatmates and share households. These potential negotiations form a market currency which is magnified by the online marketplace for flatmates and share households. Attributes likely perceived to be desirable, so full-time work status, absence from the home, are magnified, while needs to actually be at home or bring others into the home are minimised as people are trying to, they strive to present themselves as the perfect flatmate. So the digital platform for seeking or offering share accommodation doesn't necessarily change the nature of share housing, but it does potentially improve the opportunities for share households to form. Successful share households are likely those in which housemates have similar expectations around paying rent and behaviour. The ideal housemate is also one who is social, but not too sociable, independent, but not too independent. And we find similar characteristics in our ideal flatmate, of the ideal flatmate in our own research. And those are those that display a nuanced understanding of the need to balance the temporalities and the social nature of home. This has two major implications for finding home and making home in a share house. First, it places greater emphasis on the ability to make home while not being at home, which in itself critiques the idea and the meaning of home in a share house. And secondly, this presents key challenges to those who are not as easily able to manage their at-home temporalities. A house is not necessarily a home. Home is a series of feelings, attachments, including control and privacy, security, comfort, and a feeling of welcome. These don't always have to be attached with a physical structure, but the ability to feel at home is frequently determined by tenure types, with renters having less control and agency to be at home, and this being sometimes exacerbated if you're renting and sharing with non-kin. Listed behaviours in the advertisements, you know, that balance between respecting space and being social, being tidy yet being easygoing, point to the desire to create households that fit within the demands of working lives and adulthoods. And this is reiterated with an undercurrent of what's not wanted. So people bringing overnight guests over, partying, or engaging in disruptive behaviour. These characteristics of the ideal flatmate also show us, by contrast, those for whom seeking accommodation will be more challenging. People with children, the underemployed, and those with limited social and material capital to bring to the household are clearly going to face more challenges in locating appropriate accommodation and finding a place to feel secure and at home. These flatmates are potentially more temporally and socially intrusive, being more dependent on the space to actually live and less flexible in their use of the house. You know, this, you know, idea that with the single parents, for example, looking to share households with other single parents as an acknowledgement that their own lifestyle and responsibilities are not going to fit with what you know, the professional share house or the student share house, or these kind of things. So from what we saw in the data, we can see, I mean, again, it's not rocket science, but those living at share housing in Sydney perform less interest in their transient party houses and are more concerned about making home, albeit a home that is strictly temporally, socially, and materially managed. The first step in the process of making this home is mediated by digital platforms that unveil the hidden practices and networks of share accommodation in Sydney. But paradoxically, we see advertisements emphasise the desire for a home, not just a house, while suppressing the attributes of self that people actually need to live at or be at home, you know, which actually require you to spend time there. So some summary points. Share housing is growing as we see home ownership and sole renter households decline. It's primarily driven by economic reasons, but social factors are highly valued as well. We see share housing and housing more broadly being sort of digitally reconfigured, particularly by platforms. And we see because of this, this gives us an opportunity to look at the way that people are marketing themselves or performing themselves, and we can tease out these certain characteristics of share housing and flatmates that are successful to, that are important to a successful share house. And that is having employment, the ability to be outside of the house, and pertaining to rules, and basically having behavioural attitudes, particularly towards socialising, that mean you don't have to be at home very often. For those who can't meet these criteria because of, you know, underemployment or parenthood or caring responsibilities, there's going to be extra challenges in finding housing. And so I guess one of the things that came out of this research is this idea of creating home, or at least performing home, by not actually being at home. So I have some, I guess, some sort of questions for you, or maybe not for you, but just to think about from the end of this. So what does this being at home by not, what does making home by not being at home mean for our understanding of home, and what does shared living mean for our understanding of home? Considering people's attitudes towards, you know, shared spaces that came out of the sort of the data that we showed here, how can we design for shared living that reduces some of the challenges involved and takes advantages of the benefits of shared living? And what does this mean for the future of housing? What would it look like? And finally, I mean, I can't do a presentation now, it would be really remiss to talk about it, or at least not touch on COVID and the impact that that has on shared living. You know, when we have housing as the first line of, one of the first lines of defense against the coronavirus, you know, it's assumed that all people have access to a safe space to stay at home, to work from home, that their spaces aren't so intimately shared. And so what we find is, what role does sharing housing, I guess maybe we should also think about what role does sharing housing or living together play in a context when we're increasingly having to be socially distant. So that's it for me, just the references. The references slide there if you want to have a look. And I guess I'll throw it back over to Djordje. Thanks.
Thank you, Sophia. That was wonderful. Thanks very much for your talk. We have a couple of questions here.
Yeah.
Let's start with those. I have one before we go to the list of questions that is here. I actually want to ask about things that are not necessarily directly related to your both background and current research, but I'm very curious to hear your opinion. So one is the role of the design in all of this. In a sense, this is our perspective, and sort of we're looking at it from a slightly different angle than you are. And we see a lot of potential here for innovative topologies, innovative models, and we often feel that the role of the design is underestimated in this entire shift that is taking place. So I'm wondering, how does that look like from your end? How do you see the role of architecture in here?
Well, that's a really good one, actually, and a really good question, because I think, to have successful shared living, design is really important. Having a space, even if you're living communally, that's private, that you're able to have a sense of privacy in there. And if you look at some of, I don't know how many of you have shared house or not, but if you reflect on the type of share houses that have been successful, generally there's nice communal spaces, but there's the ability to retreat to your own sort of place without feeling too cramped and that kind of stuff. We had one student here do some work on older women and sort of co-living, and suggesting, doing some focus groups with women, whether they would be open to co-living. And after a few days workshop, they'd sort of come around to it. But what came through was the importance of design there, in that they particularly wanted their own space. That became it, but they wanted a communal. The communal space in a way wasn't as important as their own private space. And so they often wanted, say, a little kitchenette in their own space, so that they didn't have to use a communal kitchen if they didn't want to, socialize, but they also had that option. So I think design, and good design, plays a really important part. Some of the more, like the more entrepreneurial, sort of focused, like stemming from the hacker houses kind of stream of co-living, have very intentional design made to increase interaction and somehow magically increase all the amazing ideas that people there will generate just by bumping into each other. And then there's some work being done by Tim White over in the UK that's actually looking at how, in some of the co-living developments, how absolutely the sensors in the house, they're putting sensors in to monitor the time people are actually staying in their rooms, etc., to actually, which I think might be efficient design, but not great design for living, to squeeze less, to be able to get more out of a smaller space. So by basically making the room smaller and getting more people in, just by sort of doing that. So I don't think that's particularly good design, but they're not there for long-term living. So I think design's perspectives would be really important on this if you're going to have successful shared living. Yeah.
Okay, so here we go to the questions now. We have a question from Jasmine Palmer and from another anonymous attendee. They're similar, they're related. Mm-hmm. They would like you to comment on the gender difference, if any, and whether or not the increase in older persons seeking share accommodation perspective on home sharing. So, yeah, second one from the top that I'm reading it.
Yeah. So gender, if any, increase. Okay, so yes, so what we're finding It's also an increase in older women share housing. I think it's partly because, people who are in that context where share housing becomes an available option is that, say, for men, they're more traditionally going to go into boarding houses, which itself is a form of shared living, but we predominantly associate boarding houses with men, and they're often not a lot of women on the edge of homelessness and precarious living arrangements don't find them very comfortable or safe or secure for them. So I interviewed a few women as part of this, following on from the from this research, and an actually specific age and share housing survey where significantly more women responded than men. And yeah, so we're seeing this increase in older women having to share. And this again comes back to those structural problems where particularly the women who are older now have come through a system where they've probably been paid less over the years. They might have been in a caregiving role within a home. And so they've done a lot of unpaid labour. They don't have the financial resources to own their own home. So there are generally a couple of pathways of either being single all their life, or they've been married and been divorced and fallen out of home ownership in that. So it's sort of continuing that. It's part of that spectrum that we're seeing with older women becoming the fastest rate of homelessness in Australia.
So we would find home share at very different sides of the spectrum. So we would find it at the very vulnerable side, where we were looking at probably rooming houses, as they're called over here. But we would also find it on the completely opposite side of the spectrum. It is becoming very commercial through co-living solutions, and big companies actually trying to develop a solution which is very profitable and with a very entrepreneur side of the view. Although it's a similar recipe in terms of spatial and social side. Yeah.
Well, there's a whole spectrum of sharing that you can get on. Yeah. And I actually, a couple of the older people that I spoke to, particularly if they've had their own house previously or rented by themselves, are not particularly keen on sharing space to begin with. But when you sort of tease away and they go, oh yeah, if I could afford it, I would still, want to live by myself. I think that's because, and a lot of them relate it to having had control over their own space before. But they were the ones renting, and the ones who actually owned their home and opened it up to share were like, this is great. I feel old, and vulnerable in a way, but I have people here for social support. If I fall over, somebody's going to notice, rather than it be maybe a week when somebody's going, oh, I haven't heard, So there's that kind of positive to it as well. So, yeah.
Okay, and one more question from Andrew McKinnon, who should be working on his midterm presentation, but he's making a question here for you. And he says whether or not there is any difference in the location in terms of whether or not housing share would be applicable to middle ring suburbs as well as to inner city share housing. And you mentioned that actually the motivation is one of the key motivations is related to location, and that's the reason why people would opt for sharing. But do you see this formula potentially being successful in middle ring suburbs as well?
Yeah. I mean, again, speaking from a Sydney perspective, where even middle range is quite expensive, that's one of the things. But also, again, anywhere where they're close to public transport. So if there's a train station in the outer suburb, again, that becomes a really, you can rent for a lot less and have a bigger house generally, and still be able to commute. And again, it depends on your, your economic bracket. So often, the older women that I talked to who were share housing in regional areas because they didn't want to be close. They don't have to work anymore, but the rent was a lot cheaper out there. But it was still even cheap, like hard to afford on welfare. So yes, I think this is actually can be replicated. The geography of it is quite wide, basically. Yeah.
How about families? We're seeing that co-living providers are opening up toward toward solution that are catered not only for young professionals, individuals, or single person households, but also for families as well. And you've also mentioned BTR as another growing sector there. And do you see possibly a relationship between home sharing and BTR development?
Actually, that's a really interesting question. I hadn't actually thought about that relationship. Most of my sort of contexts that I've come across have been like one or two family who have let someone share with them but that's kind of, yeah, I don't know is my answer to that. I don't know. Sorry.
I suppose, yeah, this is more of a creative question than the research one.
But it could, I mean, I could see it working, particularly if you have like a multi-generational or extended family bit. You could all just have your own little bit and come in together, which, yeah, maybe there's a opportunity there for designing co-living for rented for co-living for multi-generation extended families. Yeah.
Okay, we've touched upon the location within the city, but here we have another question asking about the geographic location and asking do you think that reasons for sharing housing are similar in other contexts, such as social democratic countries in the global south? Any reference that you would recommend to read about?
Now that is quite interesting. I recently reviewed a paper, so it's not out yet, but there was one around sharing housing in Jakarta, where it becomes, or at least sort of like shared, it becomes a second home. So what happens is you'll have the family house in an outer province, and then the whole family might move, or majority of it, into this particular household to get, you know, closer to work or closer to school, education, things like that. And then it's sort of shared with family members that come and go as they go, and sometimes younger workers, things like that. So it becomes more about opportunity to be closer to work and education. But from what I could tell from that article, they didn't give up their other house in their hometown. We have here Pranita Shrestha, Shrestha. I've got a lisp and I can't say S's or THs very well, so that trips me up all the time. She does a lot on informal housing in Nepal, and now in informal housing in Global North. And she's done some work that kind of looks at, again, this kind of informal settlement building where it becomes sharing again. One family member will come in, set up, and it becomes this sort of extended and temporally different too. Sort of, it takes longer. So it's not like here we just go move into a house. It's they sort of build up the place to live, and they might build additional, and then they might actually rent out their original room to someone who's not kin, etc., etc. So there's informal settlements, not always the same sort of view of this type of share housing, but there's a lot of sharing going on, and there's some great work out there. So definitely look up Pranita's profile and some people around that sort of, yeah, the informal planning literature will definitely touch on that.
Thanks very much. Maybe this is a good point to conclude the talk, and maybe we hope we'll see you in person sometime as well.
Yeah.
Here in Melbourne.
I hope you're all well, and for those sharing in lockdown, time to write a book.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Maybe we can ask Daniel to have the announcement of the upcoming events. I would also like to say that we have a mini series of lectures about housing, which are part of MSD at Home series, available on our website. They include a talk by Cristia Gamboa on Laborda Housing Cooperative, Verena von Beckerath on R50 and other projects in Berlin, and most recently Darinka Chichke spoke about collaborative housing. So all of those are available on our website and YouTube channel. But also we have a number of interesting events coming up next week or in 2 weeks' time. Hanif Kara is coming to talk about practice, research, and building commons. Hopefully we'll be seeing you all there. Let's see, what else do we have? We have William Smart, hosted by Alan Pert, on 24th of September. And I think this is pretty much it. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you to Philippa and Daniel for their support, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thanks, everyone.